Welcome to this explainer. Let's just dive right in and unpack the literary architecture of an ancient text, exploring exactly how scholars decode the book of Luke. Today we're looking at this fascinating document not simply as a religious text, but as a deeply crafted piece of historical literature, one that uses some really specific narrative techniques to get its message across. So, we'll be hitting 4 main points today. 1. The human Jesus. 2. Luke's unique stories. 3. The power of parables. And 4. Decoding the text. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The human Jesus, a grounded perspective. To really begin our analysis here, we have to look at this absolutely fascinating theological paradox that Luke emphasizes way more than any other writer, and that's the absolute humanity of a divine figure. While a lot of other accounts focus heavily on divinity, Luke anchors his subject firmly in the everyday human experience.
Now think about this for a second. Did Jesus know he was the Messiah at just 1 year old? I mean, it forces us to remember that he actually had to grow in wisdom. The text explicitly tells us this. It means that as a human child, he had to learn to speak Aramaic and Hebrew, he had to learn to read, and he had to progressively figure out his own purpose over time. He wasn't just born with the vocabulary of a 30-year-old philosopher, right? This super-grounded, developmental view is a massive hallmark of Luke's writing.
And you can brilliantly see this when you contrast the different historical accounts. Take Matthew's genealogy. It traces the family lineage back to King David and Abraham, so a distinctly royal, very Jewish focus. But Luke? His focus is on universal humanity. He traces that family tree all the way back to Adam, effectively linking his subject to every single human being on Earth, not just one specific nation or royal bloodline. To push this even further, Luke continually highlights these really relatable human habits and deep emotions. He points out that Jesus attended the synagogue weekly, as was his custom, which implies a lot of routine and discipline. And Luke is the only one who shows Jesus openly weeping over the city of Jerusalem, or experiencing just sheer agonizing dread in the Garden of Gethsemane. He grounds these ancient narratives in a deeply vulnerable reality. Okay, moving on to Section 2, Luke's unique stories and his focus on the outcasts. Let's see how this builds, because his focus on humanity is perfectly mirrored by the unique stories that only he decided to include. He clearly had access to distinct sources, possibly even some eyewitnesses, that totally shaped his narrative choices.
Notice how the specific characters he chooses completely elevate the vulnerable and the marginalized. I mean, instead of wealthy royal wise men showing up at the birth, Luke gives us these blue-collar, totally unpolished shepherds. We meet the elderly Simeon. We meet an 84-year-old widow named Anna. And then there's the widow of Nain, a woman who had already lost her husband and was literally in the middle of bearing her only son, which would have rendered her completely destitute in that society. By highlighting these folks, Luke reinforces this deeply human angle, where the outcasts and the overlooked are suddenly front and center.
Get this, 17. That is a crucial number because Luke contains exactly 17 distinct parables that you literally will not find anywhere else in the historical texts. Some of the most famous stories in all of Western literature only exist today because Luke wrote them down, which naturally brings us to Jesus' absolute favorite teaching tool.
Section 3. The power of parables, metaphorical storytelling. Instead of using dry propositional logic to explain these giant philosophical concepts, Jesus engaged his audience with parables. He was actually tapping into a really rich Jewish tradition of metaphorical storytelling. Prophets like Nathan used to do this in the Old Testament, like when he used a story about a stolen lamb to trap King David into recognizing his own guilt. Stories just disarm us, and they stick in our memories.
But it's important to realize that not all parables are built the exact same way. Actually, there are 4 main types. Some are just simple similes, like saying a kingdom is like a tiny mustard seed. Some are direct example stories, where you're just supposed to mimic the hero, like the Good Samaritan. Then you have the parable proper, which reveals a broader truth without a direct call to action. And finally, you've got these complex allegories, where a bunch of different elements represent different things, like a farmer planting seeds in 4 different types of dirt. Now, to truly get these parables, you have to understand hyperbole. Parables are absolutely not meant to be taken as literal historical news reports. They are deliberate, heavily exaggerated storytelling devices. Think of it kind of like a jazz musician playing Amazing Grace. They might play it with a classical flair for one crowd and then switch to an upbeat blues rhythm for another. The core song is the same, but the delivery is adapted and exaggerated to strike a chord with whoever is listening. Here is a perfect example of that hyperbolic storytelling. In one incredibly famous parable, a king forgives a servant a debt equivalent to like $10 million. But then that very same servant goes out and literally strangles a guy who owes him a measly $100. Nobody in the ancient world actually owed a king $10 million in personal debt. It's an intentional, totally absurd, hyperbolic contrast designed to make a really profound, unforgettable point about human forgiveness.
And we can't forget about geography, because physical geography totally changes a story's meaning. The Good Samaritan, it takes place on the road going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's a steep, treacherous 4,000-foot drop through desolate desert. Historically, people called it the Way of Blood because it was infamous for violent bandit attacks. Knowing that this isn't just some casual neighborhood stroll, but a terrifying high-stakes environment adds massive narrative tension to the Samaritan's choice to actually stop and help.
All right, Section 4, Decoding the Text, Modern Interpretation. Let's pull all the way back out to the meta level. We've seen how these stories are built, but how on earth do historians and theologians interpret these 2,000-year-old texts today? As you might guess, the methodologies have swung pretty wildly over the centuries.
Seriously, interpretive methods have gone from one crazy extreme to the other. Take the early church leader Augustine. He used this intense allegorical method, where literally every tiny detail had to mean something secret. In The Good Samaritan, he actually claimed the bandits were the devil, the victim was Adam, and the random innkeeper was the Apostle Paul, which honestly has absolutely zero basis in the text itself. But then, in response to that kind of overreach, 19th century scholars swung completely the other way. They reduced every rich, multi-layered story into just a single dry bullet point. Today, modern scholars argue that both of those approaches totally miss the vibrant, nuanced reality of the writing.
Which brings us right into modern analytical methods. In the late 20th century, academic groups like the Jesus Seminar took a completely different, highly critical approach. Their ultimate goal was to dissect the text to uncover the purely historical Jesus, trying to strip away everything they thought were just later theological additions from the early church.
And to do this, they actually voted using this wild color coding system. They look at a verse in Luke and cast colored beads. Red meant they believed these were the exact historical words he spoke. Pink meant, okay, it sounds like his voice or a summary of his ideas. Gray meant it contains similar ideas but definitely wasn't his exact wording. And black meant they believed the words were completely fabricated and added later by the church. It was an incredibly controversial methodology, but it perfectly reflects this modern desire to rigidly separate the historical figure from the literary text we actually have.
And that leaves us with the ultimate paradox of these ancient texts. When he was asked why he taught in parables, Jesus quoted the ancient prophet Isaiah, basically saying he spoke this way so that audiences may be ever seeing and never perceiving. We'll leave you with this really provocative thought on why these stories were crafted this way in the first place, intentionally designed to reveal profound truths to those willing to dig deeper while actively hiding them from people who are just skimming the surface. What does that say about how we consume information today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you read.